imagine for a second that you are trying to buy a house.
Yeah.
So you walk into the bank and you sit down across from the mortgage broker.
Right.
And you confidently slide this heavy metal briefcase across the desk.
I like where this is going.
Yeah. So you click the latches, open it up, and it is stuffed to the absolute brim, but not with $100 bills.
Oh.
It's completely filled with those flimsy paper prize tickets. The ones you win at like a skee ball arcade.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Like mountains of them. And you look the broker dead in the eye and say, look at how hard I worked for these. I spent years accumulating this wealth.
I played so much whack-a-mole.
Exactly. I played so much whack-a-mole. But the broker's just going to stare at you.
Yeah.
Right? Because no matter how much of that paper you have, you brought the wrong currency.
Yeah, the bank won't even process the deposit.
Right.
Because in that specific room, under those specific rules, that lifetime of effort has absolutely zero purchasing power.
Yes, exactly. And that fundamental tension, that idea of bringing the wrong currency to pay off a massive life or death debt is, it's the exact mechanism at the heart of today's deep dive.
It really is.
We're looking at what I would call a masterclass in global event scaling and human psychology. But it's heavily disguised as a sermon. So our mission today is to dig into a very specific set of sources. We have a PDF text outline and a YouTube video transcript from a major religious event.
Right.
This took place on August 26, 2026. It's called the Global Crusade with Kumuyi, or GCK.
GCK.
And this was held in Ogun, West Nigeria, and spearheaded by Pastor Dr. W.f Kumuyi.
And just to set the table for everyone listening, we aren't here today to debate theology or, take a stance on religion.
Right, of course.
We are impartially analyzing the rhetoric, the structure, and really the underlying psychological leverage contained in this specific event.
Yeah, the mechanics of it.
Exactly. We want to explore how these concepts are conveyed to a massive audience to understand just the sheer mechanical force of a global religious movement.
Because the backdrop here is just incredible. Try to visualize this. You have tens of thousands of people gathered in Nigeria.
Huge crowds.
Huge. In the heat of the evening, right? It's a massive production that's being broadcast globally. And on one hand, the language is so steeped in ancient biblical texts and these cosmic stakes. But on the other hand, it is a hyper-modern, fiercely organized Nigerian crusade.
It's quite the contrast.
It is. And the overarching theme, tying the entire spectacle together, is this concept of the great transaction.
The great transaction. And the terminology sounds almost like a corporate merger.
It does.
Which is very intentional. The foundation of this transaction is based on Jesus's final words on the cross in the book of John, chapter 19, verse 30.
Right.
Where he says, "It is finished."
It is finished, yeah.
And the pastor uses this phrase not just as a spiritual sign-off, but as a binding economic declaration.
Like a legal receipt.
Exactly. A transaction has been mathematically completed. A debt has been settled on the books.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand a transaction, we first have to understand the currency being used.
Right.
Which brings us right back to that arcade ticket analogy. But the sermon takes it to an entirely different level.
It really does.
The economic metaphor isn't just a side note for him. It's the structural, load-bearing pillar of the whole message.
What's fascinating here is how explicit the pastor gets about what does not work as currency.
Oh, yeah, he lists them out.
He does. He doesn't just say earthly wealth. He explicitly lists the currencies out to the crowd. He says dollars, pounds, euros, naira, cedis.
He covers all the bases.
He really does.
Yeah.
He is aggressively grounding this cosmic theology in the daily economic anxiety of his audience.
Wow.
He tells them essentially that the exchange rate for their local or foreign currency in heaven is zero.
It's zero. And he goes even further than just cash, which is crazy. It's not just a warning that a billionaire can't buy their way past the pearly gates.
Right.
The text says that even if you could gather all your human achievements, your prestige, all your good works, and he uses this wild imagery.
Oh, the hair thing.
Yes, he says, even if you could miraculously turn every single hair on your head into solid silver and gold.
I love that visual.
It's so striking.
Yeah.
But he says even then, it still wouldn't be enough to purchase redemption.
It's a brilliant rhetorical device to create a state of total universal bankruptcy among the audience.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. Universal bankruptcy.
Yeah, because from the richest business tycoon in the VIP section to, the poorest attendee standing way in the back, they are instantaneously put on the exact same footing.
They're all just holding handfuls of arcade tickets.
Exactly.
So if nobody can afford the debt,
Yeah.
everybody desperately needs a benefactor.
Right.
The Bank of Heaven requires a highly specific exclusive currency, which the sermon identifies as the blood of the unblemished lamb, meaning Christ,
Right.
because human wealth is corruptible and inflated, so only this foreordained perfect sacrifice clears the ledger.
But this creates a massive theological loophole.
Oh,
Well, if the ultimate price has already been paid, I mean, if the transaction is truly finished for everyone, why isn't everyone instantly cured and saved?
oh, I see.
Why are people still suffering? The pastor has to solve this trap by introducing a strict filter.
Right, because they don't just hand the payout to everyone walking down the street.
No.
The debtor has to meet very specific terms to actually claim the benefit. And the sermon calls this requirement penitence.
Penitence, yes.
And it draws a very sharp, almost brutal distinction between just wanting your problems magically solved and possessing genuine godly sorrow.
To illustrate this, the pastor leans on a classic biblical anecdote, the two thieves who were crucified on either side of Jesus.
Okay.
He points out the psychological difference between the two men. Both thieves were in excruciating agony. Both desperately wanted relief.
Sure, of course.
But one thief just wanted earthly deliverance. He basically challenged Jesus, saying, if you're the Son of God, get us down from here.
Right. He treated the transaction like a vending machine for his immediate physical comfort.
Exactly. He wasn't penitent. He was just in pain.
Wow, that's a huge distinction.
It is. The other thief, however, acknowledged his own guilt. He recognized Christ's innocence and showed true internal remorse.
And so because of that specific psychological shift, that penitence, he received the ultimate benefit of the transaction.
Exactly right.
And the text gets incredibly specific about what this penitence looks like for this modern audience in Ogun West.
Oh, yeah, he doesn't hold back.
No. He warns the crowd against boasting about their past lives, listing standard vices, like drunkenness and immorality.
Right, the usual suspects.
Usuals, yeah. But then he leans heavily into the occult.
This is where it gets really local.
It does. He targets people who have swallowed charms, people who have demonic incisions etched into their skin, or those wearing talismans.
He demands they flesh out, confess, and utterly reject these things.
Just totally get rid of them.
Yeah, he is demanding a total renunciation of alternative spiritual power structures. You cannot hedge your bets. You can't keep a protective talisman in your pocket, just in case, while also trying to claim the benefits of the great transaction.
Right.
The benefactor demands a complete monopoly on your faith.
I was reading through this section, and I noticed something that initially seemed like a misstep to me.
What was that?
Well, you'd assume a massive evangelical crusade is aimed purely at non-believers, right? Outsiders, people who have never set foot in a church.
Right, that's the standard assumption.
But the pastor explicitly targets people who are already highly religious.
Yeah.
He ruthlessly critiques what he calls churchianity.
Churchianity, yeah, I noted that too.
He tells the crowd that merely attending a church, a synagogue, or a sanctuary means absolutely nothing without this true, raw conversion.
It seems counterintuitive to attack your own demographic.
That's what I thought, but then I realized he's actually destroying their complacency.
Oh,
He's telling them the subscription they already bought is void. When you are running a massive religious movement, your biggest enemy isn't atheism, it's cultural habit.
that's a really good point.
It's the people who show up every Sunday, drop a little money in the plate, and think they are covered because they are in the building.
By attacking churchianity, he strips away that false security.
Exactly.
He's telling them that religious outwardness, singing the songs, knowing the liturgy that can never clear a cosmic debt.
Right.
You might be sitting in the front pew, but you're still trying to pay the mortgage with skee-ball tickets?
Yes. It brilliantly reestablishes a sense of primal urgency for everyone, even the choir.
Even the choir, absolutely.
So let's follow the logic of the sermon. Let's say the listener meets these strict terms. They have genuine penitence, they throw away the talismans, they abandon their comfortable churchianity.
Okay, so they've met the conditions.
Right. Once the contract is signed, what exactly are the tangible goods and services delivered?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where the theology moves from abstract spiritual concepts to intensely practical physical reality.
I didn't notice that.
Yeah, the sermon introduces the concept of God's performance. Yes, and this is not just a promise of, floating on a cloud when you die.
Right, right.
It is a guarantee of immediate, total, physical, and social transformation happening right there in the dirt of the crusade grounds.
And the deliverables listed in this text are staggering in their specificity.
Very specific.
We aren't talking about a vague sense of inner peace.
Yeah.
The pastor promises the instantaneous termination of terminal diseases.
Yes.
And he explicitly lists them. He says tuberculosis, dry cough, elephantiasis, goiter, and hunchback.
It extends far beyond physical health, too, into deep social and economic anxieties.
Yeah, I was surprised by that.
Well, it resonates profoundly with the audience's daily reality. The pastor promises the breaking of very specific, highly relatable social curses.
And the examples he gave were fascinating me because they are so grounded in real life.
Right.
He talks about a curse placed by a disappointed suitor. You know, a jilted lover who you decided not to marry, who then curses your future out of spite.
That's such a specific cultural anxiety.
Exactly. Or he mentions a dishonest business partner who you refuse to keep working with.
Yeah.
And they look at you and say, you will know where I came from, and place a hex on your finances.
Those examples reveal so much about the cultural context of the region.
They really do.
These aren't abstract phantoms. They are the complex, messy, everyday social conflicts of life.
Yeah, just dealing with people.
A business deal goes sour, an engagement is broken off, and the resulting anxiety, the bad luck that follows, is framed as a targeted spiritual curse.
Right.
And the great transaction promises to eradicate those specific interpersonal curses instantly.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
The sermon frames this entire process, the faith, the healing, the deliverance, as a binding legal contract.
Legal contract, yeah.
There is this powerful mnemonic mantra repeated in the text. What you say is what you see is what you show, and what you show is what you share.
It's very catchy.
It is. And the pastor insists that if the believer is fully persuaded that God can perform these promises, the healing is absolutely guaranteed on the spot.
It removes all uncertainty.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because it relies on this heavy theological concept called imputation.
Imputation, right.
For anyone who isn't a theology nerd, imputation is basically a legal transfer.
Okay.
Think of it like logging into your banking app and seeing that a billionaire has legally transferred their massive account balance into your previously overdrawn account.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, the money is legally yours now.
Mm.
The sermon argues that Christ's perfection and healing have been imputed to the believer.
Got it.
The transaction is done. The receipt is printed, so the goods must be handed over. The pastor says you don't need to stand there crying and shouting and pleading. He has paid for your healing.
That contractual framing shifts the entire dynamic of prayer.
How do you mean?
Well, it's no longer God might heal you if it's part of his mysterious plan. It's the price was paid in full. Therefore, the product is yours by legal right tonight.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a huge shift.
But there's a massive psychological trap hidden inside that mechanism.
Trap. What kind of trap?
Well, if the healing is guaranteed by absolute unyielding persuasion, what happens when someone in the crowd isn't healed?
Oh, man. The blame shifts entirely onto the sick person.
Precisely. The theology is foolproof.
Yeah.
If the tumor doesn't dissolve or the elephantiasis doesn't recede, the failure cannot be with the benefactor.
Because the transaction is flawless.
Right, because the transaction is flawless. Therefore, the failure must be the beneficiary's lack of true persuasion.
That is heavy.
It is an incredibly heavy psychological burden to place on someone who is already suffering.
Yeah, can manage.
Their physical illness is now compounded by perceived spiritual failure.
So we have this massive, heavy theological framework.
We do.
We've got cosmic transactions, the strict terms of penitence, the guaranteed contractual deliverables of ending cancer, and the psychological weight of absolute persuasion.
That's a lot.
It's a ton.
Yeah.
But moving from this high-level life or death theology to the boots-on-the-ground reality, how does an event actually process thousands of these deeply emotional transactions in real time?
This brings us to the pragmatic mechanics of a modern spiritual crusade.
Right.
Because after all the heavy spiritual warfare, after the pastor is literally commanding madness to leave people's minds, canceling curses from dishonest business partners, and declaring goiters cured the tone of the event, pivots so fast it gives you whiplash.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
It immediately transitions into highly organized, rapid-fire data collection.
So what does this all mean? Because this was easily the most jarring, fascinating part of the transcript for me.
Totally.
You have this sweeping, transcendent moment People are weeping. They are being told their eternal souls are safe from damnation and their tumors are dissolving.
The stakes are incredibly high.
The stakes could not possibly be higher. And then seamlessly, the announcer gets on the microphone and says, "Our counselors are by your side. Give them your true names and your phone numbers, and please write legibly in capital letters."
They are very firm about the capital letters.
They are. The announcer is giving rapid-fire instructions to the counselors to wave flags to signal their designated zones.
Just boom, 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 boom.
Yes. They're urging them to be swift, saying, "We don't want you to spend too much time discussing and talking with them. Just write their names, contact addresses, and telephone numbers."
It goes from the eternal cosmos to strict administrative data entry in a millisecond.
In a millisecond.
The logistics of the follow-up are baked right into the spiritual climax. Mixed in with the instructions about the flags and the legible handwriting, there is a remarkably mundane announcement urging people to come back the next day.
Oh, lunchtime with Jesus.
Lunchtime with Jesus tomorrow at 3 p.m.
Yeah. And the geographic instructions they give are incredibly precise.
They are.
It's located behind the blocks of classrooms under a big white canopy on the right-hand side.
I was reading this and just laughing at the sheer juxtaposition of it. I mean, how does a person reconcile the immense stakes of the message, literally erasing a cosmic debt and curing a hunchback, with the mundane administrative instructions of write legibly in all caps and meet behind the classrooms?
It's wild.
Yeah.
But I think it pulls the curtain back on the dual nature of these mega events.
Yeah, absolutely.
On one level, for the attendee in the crowd, it is profoundly spiritual, deeply personal, transcendent experience.
It's very real for them.
But on an organizational level, it is a masterclass in event management and corporate scaling.
You cannot build a sustainable global ministry on pure emotional catharsis.
No, you need infrastructure. You need a CRM system.
You need the machinery. Getting someone to experience a moment of penitence, getting them to throw away their talisman is only step one of the funnel.
The funnel, exactly.
Retaining them, keeping them from slipping back into their old habits, and integrating them into the ongoing life of the church requires their actual phone number.
Right. You can't just let them walk away.
No,
Yeah.
It requires them showing up to the white canopy at 3:00 p.m. on a Tuesday.
The swiftness of the counselors, the command to not talk too much, just get the data that shows a deep understanding of crowd control and the fleeting nature of adrenaline.
Oh, yeah, they know.
The organizers know the emotional high of the sermon will dissipate the moment these people start walking home.
They have to capture the conversion in a database before the crowd physically disperses and reality sets back in.
It is the ultimate user onboarding experience. You hook the crowd with the highest possible stakes, the great transaction, the ultimate debt relief, the cure for their physical pain.
And then seamlessly transition them into a highly managed organizational structure.
Exactly.
This raises an important question, and it really synthesizes everything we've looked at in these sources.
Okay, let's hear it.
We are looking at a rhetorical ecosystem that masterfully blends an ancient cosmic metaphor, the blood of the lamb paying an unpayable debt, with highly specific, hyper-modern Nigerian anxieties like business fraud and tuberculosis.
It's quite the mix.
It connects an ancient solution to an immediate modern problem and then executes that connection through a pragmatically managed, data-driven live event.
And for you, our listener, whether you consider yourself deeply religious, a total skeptic, a marketer, or just someone fascinated by human behavior, understanding the structure of this event is incredibly valuable.
So valuable.
It shows how persuasive communication operates at scale. It identifies a deep, universal human vulnerability, that gnawing feeling of guilt, the terrifying lack of control over physical illness, the anxiety of social conflict.
All of it.
It takes all of that vulnerability and offers a singular, absolute solution. It recognizes that people are walking around feeling like they have massive debts they can never pay.
And it offers them a benefactor who has already cleared the ledger, provided they hand over their total allegiance and their contact information.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. We've talked about how this sermon and this movement portrays a world where every single earthly failure, every physical illness, or every bit of bad luck with a business partner is fundamentally a spiritual issue.
Right. Everything is spiritualized.
Everything. And it's an issue that can be instantly contractually finished by tapping into this great transaction.
A total immediate performance of the promise guaranteed by your own persuasion.
So think about what happens the next day. If someone truly views their entire reality through that specific lens, where a single moment of absolute belief guarantees total physical, emotional, and social perfection.
Wow.
How does that fundamentally change the way they navigate the unpredictable, often deeply unfair chaos of daily life?
That's a great question.
If you wake up on Tuesday and your tire's flat or your cough comes back, but you truly believe you hold the only cosmic currency that matters, how do you spend your days in a world that is still forcing you to trade in arcade tickets? Think about that. Get you on the next deep dive.